I've always considered myself a lucky man. I had a beautiful wife, two wonderful children, and a home that we worked hard to build together. Life was comfortable, predictable, even. I was the kind of guy who looked forward to weekend soccer games with my son, Chris, and making breakfast with my daughter, Emily, every Sunday morning. Our lives were perfect, or so I thought. It all began to unravel on a Wednesday. I came home early from work, something I never did, because of a last-minute cancellation at the office. A light rain had begun to fall, the kind that made you want to curl up on the couch and listen to the sounds outside. As I stepped into the house, something felt off, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The house was quiet, eerily so. Usually, I'd hear the kids playing or Sarah, my wife, bustling around the kitchen. But today, nothing, just silence. I called out, "Sarah?" But there was no response. Dropping my briefcase by the door, I wandered further inside. Maybe she had taken the kids out? I thought, though it was strange that she hadn't left a note. As I made my way to our bedroom, a small flicker of light caught my eye from the corner of the living room. I turned, noticing Sarah's laptop screen glowing faintly. She often left it open, but I usually avoided it. After all, we trusted each other implicitly. But something about today, something gnawed at me. I hesitated, then slowly walked over to the laptop. At first glance, everything seemed normal. Her emails were open, mostly work-related. But as I began to close the laptop, a message notification popped up. It was from someone named Ryan. I froze. Ryan? The name sounded familiar, but not in a way that made me feel comfortable. The message preview read, "Can't wait to see you tonight. Remember the last time?" Winky face. I blinked, my heart sinking in my chest. My hands trembled as I clicked on the message thread. I knew it was wrong to invade her privacy, but something told me I needed to see this. What I found hit me like a truck. The conversation with Ryan stretched back for months. The tone started innocuously enough, friendly, even professional. But somewhere around 6 weeks ago, things had shifted. The messages became flirtatious, secretive, and then outright suggestive. My stomach churned as I read lines like, "You looked incredible in that dress last time, and maybe next time we won't have to stop." My head spun, and I felt an overwhelming urge to vomit. Before I could react, I heard the front door creak open. "Hey, honey, I didn't expect you home so early," Sarah called out, her voice sweet and familiar, as if nothing had changed. I closed the laptop quickly and turned to face her. She stood in the doorway, holding a bag of groceries, her face lighting up when she saw me. For a brief second, I thought maybe this was all some kind of misunderstanding. Maybe Ryan was just a friend. Maybe I was jumping to conclusions. But then I saw her smile falter. Her eyes shifted briefly, too briefly for anyone else to notice, but I caught it, a flash of nervousness, of guilt. "Why didn't you tell me you were coming home early?" she asked, her voice just a little too casual. I shrugged, trying to keep my expression neutral. "Just wanted to surprise you," I said, forcing a smile. "Where are the kids?" "They're with my mom today. I figured I'd grab a few things for dinner while they're out." I nodded, though my mind was still racing. I needed time to process what I had just seen, time to figure out how to approach this. "I'll go change," I muttered, heading upstairs before she could see the storm brewing inside me. In the quiet of our bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed, running my hands through my hair. My mind kept going back to those messages. Who the hell was Ryan? And more importantly, how long had this been going on? I knew I couldn't confront her right away. If I did, she might lie, spin some story to cover up whatever this was. No, I needed more than just a few messages on a laptop. I needed proof. I spent the rest of that evening in a haze, going through the motions of normal life. Helping Sarah with dinner, making small talk, all while my mind replayed those texts over and over. I was trapped in my own home, surrounded by the life we had built. Yet suddenly it felt like a house of cards ready to collapse. As we got into bed that night, Sarah curled up beside me, just as she always did. She smelled of lavender, the same lotion she used every night, and it would have been so easy to close my eyes and pretend everything was okay. But I couldn't. Not anymore. As Sarah drifted off to sleep, I stared at the ceiling, my heart heavy. I knew what I had to do. Tomorrow I would start finding answers. The next morning, I woke up before Sarah, feeling the weight of yesterday's discovery like a stone pressing against my chest. I got up quietly, careful not to wake her, and slipped downstairs to the living room. Her laptop was where I had left it. The conversation with Ryan still haunted me. I needed to know more, but I couldn't let Sarah find out I'd snooped on her. I considered confronting her immediately, but decided against it. I needed more than just a few texts to truly understand the extent of this betrayal. I needed irrefutable proof. I made a mental note to set up surveillance. Sarah had never been suspicious of me or secretive about her habits before, so I hoped she wouldn't catch on if I added a little tech around the house. I'd start with her phone, but I had to be discreet. I spent the rest of the morning searching for hidden camera setups online. I ordered a few devices, small enough to conceal in places she wouldn't think to look. I also ordered a phone cloning tool that would allow me to copy all her incoming and outgoing texts, calls, and emails without touching her phone after the initial setup. By the time Sarah came downstairs, the devices were already on their way, and I felt a strange sense of anticipation, a mix of dread and determination. I wasn't sure what I would uncover, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't be good. For the next few days, I went about life as usual, acting as if nothing had changed. Sarah continued to smile and laugh with me, just like always, but now I couldn't help but question every interaction, every glance she made at her phone. By Friday, the devices had arrived. That evening, Sarah had gone out with friends, something she did occasionally, but it now took on a more suspicious tone. I used the opportunity to install the hidden cameras. One in the kitchen, another in the living room, and one in our bedroom. Then, I moved onto her phone. I needed only a few minutes with it to clone everything. My heart raced the entire time. Once everything was set, I sat down and waited, hoping I wasn't about to discover something that would tear our family apart. The next morning, while Sarah was out running errands, I checked the phone clone. The first few messages seemed innocent, texts from friends, her mom, even some from me. Then I saw Ryan's name pop up. My stomach turned as I opened the thread. It was worse than I expected. Their messages had grown increasingly intimate. They had met several times. Sarah mentioned the quiet hotel they went to, how she couldn't stop thinking about him. She talked about how she needed more from him, and he responded with explicit promises of their next meeting. There was no doubt about it now. Sarah was having a full-blown affair, and it had been going on for months. I felt sick. Every part of me wanted to march out the door, find Sarah, and scream at her, demand an explanation for this betrayal. But I stopped myself. That wasn't enough. I had to be smarter. I needed to think through my next steps, protect myself, and more importantly, protect the kids from the fallout that was sure to come. I had one more task left, getting the paternity test back. As painful as the thought was, I couldn't ignore the possibility that Ryan wasn't just some fling. If Sarah had been seeing him long enough, there was a chance that Chris or Emily, or both, weren't even mine. The wait for the DNA results was excruciating. In the meantime, I tried to maintain some sense of normalcy at home. The kids were oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface, and Sarah continued to act like everything was fine. She would kiss me on the cheek before heading out for work or meeting up with friends. Each time she did, I had to fight the urge to pull away. I spent my days analyzing every interaction I caught on the hidden cameras. Most of the footage was unremarkable, just mundane moments of our lives. But one afternoon, I caught Sarah making a phone call that sent chills down my spine. She was in the kitchen, speaking in hushed tones. At first, I couldn't hear much, but then her voice became clearer. "I miss you too," she whispered. "I'll see you next week. Don't worry, he'll be out of town." My heart sank. She was planning her next rendezvous with Ryan right under my nose. I felt the walls closing in, the weight of the secret I was carrying becoming too much to bear. But I stayed quiet, waiting for the right moment to confront her. A week later, the DNA results arrived in a plain envelope. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside were the cold, hard facts that would determine whether my children were truly mine. Chris, my son, my firstborn, was mine. Relief flooded through me, but it was quickly overshadowed by the second result. Emily, my beautiful daughter, was not. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. My breath caught in my throat, and the room spun around me. I clutched the edge of the kitchen counter, trying to steady myself. Emily wasn't mine. I couldn't comprehend it. I couldn't understand how Sarah could have lied to me, cheated on me, and let me believe that Emily, our sweet, innocent daughter, was mine. I had raised her, loved her, and now I had to face the reality that she wasn't biologically mine. It was like a knife to the heart, a betrayal so deep that I didn't know how to move forward. I wanted to cry, to scream, but instead, I stood there, numb, staring at the papers in my hands. I had my proof. The affair wasn't just a fling. Sarah had been cheating on me for years. I couldn't wait any longer. I had the proof I needed, and it was time for Sarah to face the consequences of her actions. That evening, after the kids were in bed, I sat at the kitchen table, waiting for her to come home. When she walked through the door, she was smiling, her face glowing from whatever lie she had been living. But when she saw me sitting there, her smile faded. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly as she sensed the shift in the atmosphere. I didn't say anything at first. I just slid the DNA results across the table. She looked down at them, her face blanching as she realized what they were. "Care to explain?" I asked, my voice cold and detached. Sarah's hands shook as she picked up the papers, her eyes darting across the words. Tears welled up in her eyes, but I felt nothing for her in that moment. Only anger, betrayal, and a deep, gnawing sadness. I can explain," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. "Oh, please. I'd love to hear your explanation for how our daughter isn't mine." She broke down then, sobbing uncontrollably. But her tears did nothing for me. They didn't erase the months of lies, the texts, the hotel meetups, the betrayal. I was beyond the point of feeling pity for her. "It was a mistake," she cried. "I didn't mean for this to happen. It got out of control." I shook my head. "A mistake? A mistake is forgetting to pick up the dry cleaning. This," I pointed at the papers, my voice rising. "This was a choice. A choice you made every time you slept with him. A choice you made when you hid this from me. When you lied to me. When you let me believe that Emily was mine. I never wanted to hurt you," she sobbed. "I love you, I swear." I slammed my fist down on the table, cutting her off. "Love me? Don't you dare say you love me. You don't do this to someone you love." She flinched at my outburst, but I didn't care. I was done pretending, done playing the role of the loving, trusting husband. She had torn our family apart, and there was no going back. "I'm taking the kids," I said, my voice steady now. "And I'm filing for divorce. You can explain to Emily why her father isn't really her father. You can explain to Chris why their family is falling apart. But I'm done with you." Sarah collapsed into a chair, her sobs growing louder as the reality of her situation sank in. But I didn't stay to watch her break down. I walked upstairs, packed a bag, and left the house. As I drove away from the house that night, my mind was racing with 1,000 thoughts. What would happen next? How would I protect the kids? What would life look like without the woman I had spent nearly a decade with? I stopped at a motel just outside of town, the kind of place where nobody asks questions, and checked in for the night. The silence of the room was deafening. The weight of everything that had just happened crashed down on me. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall, my hands gripping the edge of the mattress as though holding on would keep me from falling apart. How had everything gone so wrong? I had loved Sarah with everything I had, built a life with her, trusted her. And yet, she had been unfaithful for years, deceiving me. And the worst part was, she had let me believe that Emily was mine. The betrayal was almost too much to bear. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every time I closed my eyes, images of Sarah and Ryan flashed through my mind. I imagined them meeting in secret, laughing, touching each other. It made my skin crawl. I wondered how long she had been lying to me, how many times she had come home after being with him and looked me in the eye, acting as though everything was normal. And then there was Emily. Sweet, innocent Emily. I had raised her, loved her as my own. The thought of losing her, of telling her the truth about her parentage, was unbearable. How could I look in her little eyes and tell her that the man she called Daddy wasn't really her father? It wasn't her fault. None of this was her fault. But she would pay the price for her mother's mistakes, just like Chris and I would. I spent most of the night thinking, try to come up with a plan. By morning, I knew what I had to do. First, I had to secure custody of the kids. I couldn't let Sarah poison their minds or drag them into her mess. Then, I had to confront Ryan. He was just as responsible for destroying my family as she was. I wanted answers, and I wasn't going to rest until I had them. The next day, I called a divorce lawyer. I had never imagined myself in this position, sitting across from a stranger, laying out the details of my marriage's collapse. The lawyer listened patiently as I told him about the affair, the DNA test, and my plans to file for divorce and seek full custody of the kids. "You have a strong case," he said after I had finished. "Infidelity, especially when it leads to a question of paternity, is taken very seriously in family court. But it's not going to be easy. You need to be prepared for a fight." I nodded, my jaw tight. I was ready for whatever it took. "I'll do whatever it takes to keep my kids safe." "Good. We'll file for emergency temporary custody as soon as possible," the lawyer said, scribbling some notes on a pad. "In the meantime, you need to gather any evidence you have of the affair. Texts, emails, anything that shows her unfaithfulness." I pulled out my phone and showed him the cloned messages from Sarah's phone. "I've already got that covered." The lawyer raised an eyebrow, impressed. "That's good. It'll help build your case. Just be careful. Don't do anything that could be seen as retaliatory or vengeful. The court doesn't look kindly on parents who try to alienate the other party, even in cases like this." I nodded, understanding the gravity of his advice. This wasn't just about getting revenge on Sarah for what she had done. This was about protecting my children and making sure they didn't get caught in the crossfire. "I'll handle it the right way," I promised. After leaving the lawyer's office, I felt a strange sense of calm. For the first time since I had discovered the affair, I had a plan. I was in control, and while the road ahead would be hard, I was ready to fight for my kids. The next step was confronting Ryan. I knew where he worked, thanks to the messages I had seen, and I wasn't about to let him walk away from this unscathed. I had played out the confrontation in my head 100 times, imagining myself walking into his office and throwing him against the wall demanding answers. But I knew I couldn't afford to lose my temper. This wasn't about me getting satisfaction. It was about getting the truth. I waited outside his office building the next afternoon, watching people go in and out. Finally, I saw him. Tall, broad-shouldered, clean-shaven. He looked like the kind of guy who had it all together. The kind of guy who thought he could take whatever he wanted, including another man's wife. My fists clenched at my sides as he walked toward his car. I stepped in front of him before he could open the door. "Ryan," I said, my voice low. He looked up, surprised at first, then recognition flickered in his eyes. His expression shifted from confusion to something more defensive. "Who the hell are you?" he asked, his voice laced with irritation. "You know exactly who I am," I replied, my gaze never leaving his. "I'm Sarah's husband." Ryan's face paled, and for a brief moment, I saw a flicker of fear cross his features. But he quickly composed himself, giving me a condescending smirk. "What do you want?" he asked, crossing his arms over his chest. "If you're here to fight, I don't have time for this." "I'm not here to fight," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I'm here for answers." Ryan scoffed, looking around the parking lot as if to make sure no one was watching. "Look, whatever issues you and Sarah have, that's between you two. She made her choices, and I'm not responsible for her decisions." "Not responsible?" I spat, feeling the anger surge inside me. "You've been screwing my wife for months, maybe even years. You think you could just walk away from that without any consequences?" Ryan straightened, his smirk fading. "Look, man, I didn't know about the kids, okay? Sarah never told me she was still with you. Don't lie to me," I snapped. "You knew damn well she was married. You knew exactly what you were doing." He opened his mouth to say something else, but I wasn't interested in hearing more excuses. "Stay away from my family," I said, my voice cold and final. "If I ever see you near Sarah or my kids again, I swear to God, you'll regret it." Ryan took a step back, his expression hardening. "Fine," he muttered. "You won't see me again." Without another word, I turned and walked away, leaving him standing there. As I got back in my car, my hands shook, adrenaline still pumping through my veins. But at least now I had faced him. I had said my piece, and I could finally put that part of this nightmare behind me. The hardest part was still ahead, telling Chris and Emily about the divorce, and worse, telling Emily the truth about her parentage. I had wrestled with how to do it, dreading the moment when I would have to look into my daughter's innocent eyes and break her heart. But there was no avoiding it. The longer I waited, the harder it would be. One Saturday morning, after Sarah and I had decided on a temporary schedule for sharing time with the kids, I took them out for ice cream. It was a beautiful day, the kind of day where you just want to forget all your troubles and live in the moment. But I knew I couldn't put it off any longer. "Hey guys," I said as we sat down at a picnic table near the park. "I need to talk to you about something important." Chris looked up from his ice cream, his brow furrowing in confusion. Emily, sitting next to him, smiled up at me, oblivious to the storm about to hit. "What is it, Dad?" Chris asked, sensing the seriousness in my voice. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. "Your mom and I, we've been having some problems, and we've decided that we're going to live apart for a while." Chris's face fell, and I could see the fear in his eyes. "You're getting divorced?" I nodded, my throat tight. "Yeah, buddy. But it's not your fault, okay? It's something between me and your mom, and we both love you and Emily very much. That's never going to change." Emily's smile faded as she glanced between me and Chris. "Does that mean we won't live together anymore?" "You'll still see both of us," I said quickly. "We're going to make sure you spend time with both me and your mom." "But why, Daddy?" Emily's voice trembled. "Why can't we all live together like before?" The question cut me to the core. How could I explain to a 5-year-old that her mother had betrayed us? That everything we thought was true had been a lie? I reached out and took her small hand in mine. "Sweetheart, sometimes things don't work out the way we want them to," I said softly. "But you and your brother are the most important things in the world to me. No matter what happens between me and your mom, I'll always be here for you. Always." Emily's lower lip quivered, and tears filled her eyes. Chris reached out and put his arm around her, pulling her close. I watched them, my heart breaking for what this divorce would do to them. For now, I couldn't bring myself to tell Emily the full truth about her parentage. That was a conversation for another day, when she was older and able to understand. But as I watched her and Chris huddle together, I knew that the damage had already been done. In the weeks following the confrontation and the lawyer's meeting, Sarah and I settled into an uneasy routine. She stayed in the house for the time being, while I rented a small apartment nearby. We kept things civil for the sake of the kids, but every interaction was laced with tension and resentment. One evening, after I had dropped the kids off at her house, Sarah stopped me as I was leaving. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice hesitant. I turned to face her, keeping my expression neutral. "What about?" She looked down at her hands, twisting them nervously. "About us. About everything that's happened." I felt a surge of anger rise in me, but I forced it down. "There's nothing to talk about, Sarah. We're done." Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I saw a glimpse of the woman I had fallen in love with all those years ago. "Please," she whispered. "I made a mistake, a terrible mistake, and I'm so sorry. I know I've hurt you, and I'll never forgive myself for what I've done. But I love you, and I want to fix this." I stared at her, incredulous. "You want to fix this? After everything you've done? You think you can just apologize and make it all go away?" "No, I know I can't," she said, her voice breaking. "But I'm begging you to give me a chance. For the kids' sake. For us." I shook my head, my heart hardening against her tears. "You destroyed our family, Sarah. You lied to me, cheated on me, and let me believe that Emily was mine. How do you expect me to forgive that?" "I don't know," she sobbed, "but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right. I'll go to therapy. I'll cut off all contact with Ryan, anything. Just please, don't leave me." Her desperation was palpable, and for a brief moment, I felt a flicker of sympathy for her. But it was quickly extinguished by the weight of her betrayal. There was no going back, no undoing the damage that had been done. "I'm sorry, Sarah," I said, my voice cold and final. "But it's too late." With that, I turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the doorway, her sobs echoing behind me. The next few months were a whirlwind of legal battles, custody hearings, and tense negotiations. Despite Sarah's tearful pleas, I held firm in my decision to divorce her and seek full custody of the kids. I wasn't going to let her mistakes tear them apart any more than they already had. Sarah fought me on the custody issue, though. She argued that the kids needed both of us, that we should share custody equally. But I knew better. While I didn't want to rip Chris and Emily away from their mother completely, I couldn't trust her judgment anymore. How could I? After what she had done, the court hearings were grueling. Sarah's lawyer tried to paint her as a devoted mother who had made one mistake. But I had all the evidence, the texts, the emails, the DNA test results. There was no hiding what she had done. Still, the judge was reluctant to strip her of custody completely. They almost always favored shared custody in cases like this, even when one parent had been unfaithful. In the end, we were granted joint custody, but I was given primary custody of Chris and Emily. Sarah would have visitation rights, but they would live with me most of the time. It wasn't the victory I had hoped for, but it was the best I could do under the circumstances. The day the custody decision came through, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. I had won, but it didn't feel like a victory. There were no winners in this mess, only survivors. The weeks that followed the finalization of the divorce were filled with a strange kind of numbness. My days were occupied with getting the kids ready for school, working long hours to make sure I could provide for them, and trying to piece together some semblance of a new life. But every night, when the house was quiet and the kids were asleep, I was left alone with my thoughts and the overwhelming emptiness Sarah's betrayal had left behind. Chris seemed to be coping better than I expected. He was a tough kid, stronger than I gave him credit for. He had questions, of course. Why did Mom and Dad split up? What did it mean for his future? But I reassured him that no matter what, he was loved, and I would always be there for him. Emily was a different story. She was young, too young to understand the full extent of what had happened. But even at 5, she knew something wasn't right. She cried more often, asking why Mommy didn't live with us anymore. Each time, I had to hold back the truth, swallowing the urge to tell her everything. I knew I couldn't keep the secret of her parentage from her forever. At some point, I would have to tell Emily that I wasn't her biological father. But when? How could I possibly break that news to her without shattering her sense of identity? It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about protecting her from the pain that would come with the truth. Despite everything, Sarah tried to maintain her role in the kids' lives. She would pick them up for her scheduled visits, bringing them back with forced smiles and bags of toys to distract from the chaos we had thrust them into. But I could see it. Behind her eyes, the cracks in her facade were growing. She had lost more than just her marriage. Word of the affair had spread through our circle of friends, and the social fallout was brutal. Friends we had known for years turned their backs on her. Some stopped inviting her to events. Others were more blunt, telling her outright that they didn't want her around anymore. It was a kind of social exile, and it hit Sarah hard. On top of that, Ryan had disappeared from her life. I had made it clear that he wasn't welcome near the kids, and whether it was out of fear of retaliation or just guilt, he seemed to have taken the hint. Sarah was left alone, dealing with the consequences of her actions without the man she had betrayed me for. One evening, she called me out of the blue. I hadn't expected to hear from her outside of anything related to the kids, so when I saw her name flash on my phone, I hesitated before answering. "What is it, Sarah?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before she spoke. I don't know how to do this anymore, Tony." I could hear the strain in her voice, the weight of everything crashing down on her. But I wasn't in the mood to play therapist. "You don't know how to do what?" "Any of it," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I've lost everything. You, the kids, my friends. It's like I'm a ghost of my old life, and I don't know how to fix it." For a moment, I felt a flicker of sympathy for her. But then I remembered everything she had done, the lies, the betrayal, the broken promises. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with them. "You should have thought of that before you destroyed our family," I said coldly. "I'm not the one who can fix this for you, Sarah. You're going to have to figure that out on your own." She sniffled on the other end, trying to hold back her tears. Do you think the kids will ever forgive me?" I closed my eyes, leaning back against the wall. "I don't know. That's something you'll have to earn from them, not me." She hung up after that, and I didn't hear from her again for a while. Months passed, and we slowly adjusted to our new lives. The divorce was final, and the wounds, while still raw, had started to scar over. I was doing my best to move on, to create a stable environment for the kids, but the truth about Emily still weighed on me. I knew I couldn't keep it from her forever. The day finally came when I had no choice but to confront it. Emily had been asking more questions lately about why we didn't live with Mommy anymore, about why things felt different. I had done my best to shield her, to tell her that sometimes parents just can't live together. But it wasn't enough. One evening, as I was tucking her into bed, she looked up at me with those wide, innocent eyes and asked the question I had been dreading for months. "Daddy, why don't I look like you?" The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. How could I explain this to her without breaking her heart? I had rehearsed this conversation in my head 100 times, but now that the moment had come, I didn't know what to say. "Well, sweetheart," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. "Sometimes families are a little more complicated than they seem." Emily frowned, clearly confused. "What do you mean?" I took a deep breath, sitting down on the edge of her bed. This was it. There was no turning back now. "Emily, you know how much I love you, right? You and your brother are the most important things in the world to me." She nodded, her eyes wide with curiosity. "The thing is, I'm not your biological father," I said slowly, watching her reaction closely. "You see, when you were born, your mommy and I were together, and I've always loved you as my own. But biologically, you have a different father." Her brow furrowed in confusion. "But you're still my daddy, right?" Tears stung my eyes as I nodded. "Yes, sweetheart. I will always be your daddy. That will never change." Emily stared at me for a long moment, processing the information. Then she crawled into my lap, wrapping her tiny arms around my neck. "I don't care," she whispered. "You're my daddy." I hugged her tightly, feeling the tears slip down my cheeks. In that moment, I knew that no matter what had happened, no matter what the DNA test had said, Emily was mine in every way that mattered. After my conversation with Emily, something shifted inside me. The weight of the past started to lift, and I began to see a way forward, not just for me, but for the kids as well. We had been through hell, but we were still standing. We had each other, and that was enough. Sarah continued to have visitation with the kids, but our interactions were minimal. I had forgiven her in the sense that I no longer held on to the anger that had consumed me for so long. But I would never forget what she had done. There was no going back to the way things were, and I had made my peace with that. I threw myself into work, focusing on providing for Chris and Emily, making sure they had everything they needed. And slowly, bit by bit, life started to feel normal again. The kids adjusted to the new routine, and I started to rebuild the pieces of my life that had been shattered by Sarah's betrayal. But moving on didn't mean forgetting. There were days when the pain of what had happened still hit me like a wave. Days when I would see a happy family at the park or hear a song that reminded me of the life I had lost. But those moments were becoming fewer and farther between. One evening, about a year after the divorce was finalized, I sat on the back porch, watching the sunset while Chris and Emily played in the yard. The warm breeze rustled through the trees, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. We had survived. We had made it through the storm, and while life would never be perfect, it was enough. A few months after my conversation with Emily, I received a call from Sarah. It had been a long time since we had spoken about anything other than the kids, and hearing her voice instantly brought back a flood of old memories, both good and bad. "Tony, we need to talk," she said quietly. My instinct was to shut her down, to tell her we had nothing left to discuss. But something in her voice stopped me. There was a vulnerability there that I hadn't heard in a long time. "About what?" I asked, my tone neutral. There was a long pause before she spoke again. "I'm not doing well," she admitted. I thought I could move on, rebuild my life, but it's been harder than I expected." A part of me wanted to say, "Of course it's hard. You destroyed everything." But I held back, choosing instead to listen. I had already gotten the answers I needed from her months ago. This was no longer about revenge or making her suffer. It was about finding a way to coexist for the sake of our children. "What do you need, Sarah?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. I miss them, she whispered, referring to the kids. I know I have visitation, but it's not the same. I feel like I'm losing them. I leaned back in my chair, running a hand through my hair. I had suspected this was coming. Sarah's once vibrant social life had crumbled after the affair became public. Her friends had distanced themselves, and she had been left with little support. Even her family had begun to pull away, uncomfortable with the choices she had made. "What are you asking for?" I said carefully. "I know I messed up," she said, her voice breaking. "I know I don't deserve to ask for anything after what I did. But can we try to work out a better arrangement for the kids? I'm not asking for more custody. I just want more time with them." I sighed, feeling the weight of her words. As much as I resented Sarah for what she had done, she was still their mother. And despite everything, she hadn't been a bad parent to them. She had made a mess of our marriage, but she loved Chris and Emily. "I'll think about it," I said after a long pause. "But I need to know you're serious about this, Sarah. I'm not going to let them be dragged through more chaos." "I am," she said quickly. "I'll do anything to prove it." After I hung up, I sat there for a long time, staring out the window. Sarah was asking for something I wasn't sure I could give her: trust. But for the sake of the kids, I had to at least try. Over the next few weeks, I agreed to give Sarah a little more time with the kids. It wasn't easy. Every instinct I had told me to keep her at arm's length, to protect Chris and Emily from the mess their mother had created. But I couldn't deny that the kids missed her. Despite everything, they still loved her, and I had to respect that. We started with an extra night here and there. Sarah picked them up from school one afternoon and kept them for dinner, bringing them back later that evening. The first few times, I found myself pacing the floor, checking the clock every 5 minutes. But each time, the kids returned happy, and Sarah made sure they were well taken care of. It wasn't long before Sarah began to ask for more time, and while I was still wary, I couldn't deny that the kids were benefiting from the extra attention. Slowly, cautiously, I allowed her more access: weekend afternoons, an extra overnight stay here and there. It was a delicate balance, one that required a lot of trust that I wasn't entirely sure I was ready to give. But I wasn't doing it for Sarah. I was doing it for Chris and Emily. As the months passed, the tension between Sarah and me began to ease. We weren't friends, and we likely never would be again, but we had found a way to co-parent without tearing each other apart. I focused on my work and raising the kids, trying my best to move forward with my life. But something was still missing. It took me a long time to even think about dating again. The scars from Sarah's betrayal ran deep, and I wasn't sure I was ready to let anyone else into my life. But one day, while dropping the kids off at school, I met someone. Her name was Rachel, and she was a teacher at Chris and Emily's school. We had crossed paths a few times in the hallways, exchanging polite smiles and small talk. She was kind, with a warm smile that put me at ease. I hadn't thought much of it. After all, I wasn't looking for anything. But one morning, as I dropped the kids off, she stopped me. "Tony, right?" she said, smiling brightly as she approached. "I've seen you around a lot. You're Chris and Emily's dad." I nodded, returning her smile. "Yeah, that's me. I just wanted to say how great they are," she said, her eyes sparkling. "They're really wonderful kids." "Thanks," I said, feeling a swell of pride. "I'm pretty proud of them." We chatted for a few minutes, and before I knew it, Rachel had asked if I wanted to grab coffee sometime. I hesitated, my mind flashing back to everything that had happened with Sarah. But there was something about Rachel's kindness, her easygoing nature, that made me want to take a chance. "Yeah," I said, finally nodding. "I'd like that." Rachel and I began seeing each other casually. At first, I kept it light, not wanting to dive into anything too serious. I wasn't ready to bring her into my kids' lives yet, not after everything they had been through. But as time went on, I found myself opening up to her more and more. She was understanding, patient, and never pushed me for more than I was ready to give. It wasn't long before Chris and Emily noticed that I was spending more time away from home in the evenings. One night, after I had come back from a date with Rachel, Chris sat me down. "Dad, are you seeing someone?" he asked bluntly, his eyes wide with curiosity. I blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Why do you ask, buddy?" He shrugged. "You've been going out a lot lately. Emily and I were wondering if you're, dating someone." I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through me. Chris had always been sharp, always able to pick up on things quickly. Yeah, I've been seeing someone, I admitted. Her name is Rachel. She's a teacher at your school. Chris's eyes widened even further. Really? Is she nice? She's very nice, I said, ruffling his hair. I think you'd like her. Emily, who had been playing nearby, overheard our conversation and immediately ran over. Daddy, you have a girlfriend? I laughed, pulling her onto my lap. Not exactly a girlfriend. We're just getting to know each other. Can we meet her? Emily asked, her eyes bright with excitement. Not yet, I said, smiling down at her. But maybe soon. It took me a while to feel comfortable enough to introduce Rachel to the kids. I wanted to make sure it was the right time, that they were ready to meet someone new. But after a few months of dating, I felt like we were in a good place. Rachel had been nothing but understanding and supportive, and I trusted that she would handle meeting the kids with the same care. One Saturday afternoon, I invited Rachel over for dinner. Chris and Emily were both excited, though a little nervous, and I could tell that they were eager to meet her. When Rachel arrived, she immediately put them at ease. She was kind and gentle with them, asking them about their favorite activities and making them laugh with her stories about teaching. By the end of the evening, Chris and Emily were both chatting with her as if they had known her for years. As I watched them interact, I felt a strange sense of relief. I had worried about how the kids would react to someone new in my life, especially after everything they had been through with Sarah. But Rachel was a natural with them, and I could see that she genuinely cared about making them feel comfortable. After the kids had gone to bed, Rachel and I sat on the porch, sipping wine and talking about the evening. They're great kids, Tony, she said softly, her hand resting on mine. You've done an amazing job with them. I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through me. Thanks. I've had a lot of help. Rachel leaned in, kissing me gently. I'm really happy I met you. For the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful about the future. Maybe, just maybe, I could have a second chance at happiness. As the months passed, my relationship with Rachel grew stronger. She became a constant presence in my life, and eventually, in Chris and Emily's lives too. Sarah wasn't thrilled about me seeing someone new, especially someone who worked at the kids' school, but she kept her opinions to herself. We had come too far to let old wounds reopen. Rachel and I didn't rush things. We took our time, allowing the kids to get used to the idea of us being together. But eventually, it became clear that we were serious about each other. We started talking about the future, about what it would look like to build a life together. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Rachel and I sat down on the couch, her head resting on my shoulder. I've been thinking, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, about the future, about us. I turned to look at her, my heart skipping a beat. What about us? She smiled, her eyes filled with warmth. I love you, Tony, and I love Chris and Emily. I want to be a part of your life, a real part. I reached out, taking her hand in mine. You already are. I mean it, she said, her voice steady. I want to build a life with you. With all of you. It was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment when I realized that I had finally found someone who wasn't just a part of my life, but a part of my family. And as I looked into Rachel's eyes, I knew that no matter what had happened in the past, the future was ours to build. Life was starting to settle into a comfortable rhythm with Rachel, the kids, and even Sarah. However, Sarah's struggles continued to worsen. Though she had tried to rebuild her life after the divorce, the consequences of her choices seemed to grow heavier with time. Her social isolation deepened as friends drifted away, and her professional life had taken a hit after some of her coworkers found out about the affair. One afternoon, I got a call from Sarah that shook me more than I expected. Tony, she said, her voice weak and shaky. I need to talk to you. It's important. I was driving home with the kids when I answered the call. Can it wait until later? I'm with the kids. There was a long pause on her end, then a barely audible, no, it can't. The tone in her voice sent a chill down my spine. I told the kids to be quiet for a moment and parked the car. What's going on, Sarah? I asked, concerned. I'm not okay, Tony. I've been struggling. I'm trying to hold it all together, but I don't think I can anymore. Her voice cracked, and I realized this wasn't just a normal bad day for her. Sarah sounded like she was at the end of her rope. I closed my eyes, fighting back the flood of emotions. No matter what she had done, I didn't want to see her self-destruct. "Are you at home?" I asked. "Yeah. Okay. I'll drop the kids off with my mom and come over." I called my mother, explained that I needed her to watch Chris and Emily for a bit, and then drove straight to Sarah's place. When I arrived, I found her sitting on the couch, eyes red and puffy from crying. She looked smaller than I remembered, frail. "What's going on, Sarah?" I asked, sitting down across from her. She took a deep breath, wiping her tears. "I've been spiraling, Tony. I'm trying to be there for the kids, but everything is falling apart. Work, friends, nothing is going right. I've messed up so much, and I don't know how to fix it." I sat there, feeling a complicated mix of emotions. Anger, resentment, pity. This was the woman who had once destroyed me, and now she was falling apart before my eyes. But something in me softened. Maybe it was the fact that she was still the mother of my children, or maybe I just couldn't stand to see someone suffering like this. "You need help, Sarah?" I said gently. "Professional help." She nodded, staring down at her hands. "I know. I've been thinking about it, but I'm scared. I'll help you find someone," I said. "But you have to commit to getting better, for yourself and for the kids." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Tony." That night, I made a few phone calls and found a therapist for Sarah to talk to. It was a small step, but it was a step toward her getting the help she desperately needed. I knew it wasn't my responsibility to fix her life. She had to do that on her own, but I couldn't let her collapse. Not when the kids needed her. In the weeks that followed, Sarah began seeing a therapist regularly. Slowly, she started to stabilize, though I could see that it was a long road ahead for her. The kids noticed the change too. They seemed happier during their visits with her, though they didn't know about the darker struggles she was facing. Meanwhile, things with Rachel were going better than ever. We had been together for almost a year now, and she had become an integral part of my life. She was wonderful with Chris and Emily, and I could see the bond between them growing stronger every day. But one evening, while we were having dinner, Rachel brought up something I hadn't expected. "Tony, I've been thinking about Sarah," she said hesitantly. I raised an eyebrow. "What about her?" "I'm worried about how much she's relying on you," Rachel admitted. "I know you want to help her, and I respect that, but it seems like she's leaning on you for more than just co-parenting." I put my fork down, trying to understand where she was coming from. "What do you mean?" Rachel sighed, looking down at her plate. "I know Sarah's going through a lot, but you're not her husband anymore. You've done more than enough for her, but I don't want her to drag you down with her problems. You deserve to move on, to live your life without being pulled back into her mess." I hadn't expected Rachel to feel this way, but I understood her concerns. It was true. I had been stepping in to help Sarah more than I probably should have, but the thought of completely cutting her off felt wrong. "I get what you're saying," I said carefully, "but I can't just turn my back on her. She's still the mother of my kids, and I want her to be okay, for their sake." Rachel reached across the table, taking my hand. "I know, and I admire that about you. But you need to set some boundaries for your own sake. You can't fix her life, Tony." Her words hit home. I had spent so much time trying to make sure Sarah didn't completely fall apart that I hadn't stopped to think about how it was affecting me. Rachel was right. I couldn't carry Sarah's burdens anymore. She had to learn to stand on her own. "I'll talk to her," I promised. The next time I saw Sarah, I sat her down and told her what had been weighing on me. I explained that while I would always support her when it came to the kids, I couldn't be her emotional crutch anymore. She needed to lean on her therapist, her family, anyone but me. Sarah took it better than I expected. She seemed to understand that I wasn't abandoning her, just stepping back to let her heal on her own terms. "You're right," she said quietly. "I've been using you as a safety net because I didn't want to face everything alone. But I can't do that to you. It's not fair. I'll always be here for the kids," I told her. "But you need to build your own support system." She nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek. "I will. Thank you for everything, Tony. I don't deserve it, but thank you." With that conversation, a weight lifted from my shoulders. I had spent so much time worrying about Sarah that I hadn't allowed myself to fully move on. Now, for the first time, I felt like I could. One evening, about 2 years after the divorce, I took Rachel out for a quiet dinner at our favorite restaurant. The kids were with Sarah for the weekend, and I knew the moment was right. As we sat down, sipping wine and talking about our plans for the future. I felt a sense of calm wash over me. For the first time in years, I wasn't weighed down by the past. I wasn't haunted by the betrayal, the lies, or the hurt. I was free. Rachel, I began, my heart racing. There's something I want to ask you. She looked at me, her eyes full of warmth. What is it? I reached into my pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. Her eyes widened as I opened it to reveal a diamond ring. Will you marry me? I asked, my voice steady, despite the butterflies in my stomach. Tears welled up in her eyes as she smiled, nodding quickly. Yes, yes, of course I will. I slipped the ring on her finger, and in that moment I knew that everything I had gone through, the pain, the heartache, the loss, had led me to this. To her. We kissed, and the restaurant erupted in applause. But all I could focus on was the woman in front of me. The woman who had shown me that love could heal even the deepest wounds. Telling the kids about the engagement was another big step. Chris and Emily had grown close to Rachel over the past 2 years, but I was still nervous about how they would react to the idea of me getting married again. One evening, after dinner, I sat them down in the living room. So, I have some news, I began, smiling at them. Emily, now 7, looked up at me curiously. What is it, Daddy? Rachel and I are getting married, I said, watching their faces closely. Chris, who was now 10, grinned. Does that mean Rachel will live with us? I laughed, relieved by his reaction. Yeah, it does. Yay! Emily cheered, throwing her arms around me. I love Rachel. My heart swelled with happiness as I hugged them both. I had worried so much about how they would take the news, but they were more excited than I could have imagined. Rachel had already become a part of their lives, and now she would officially become part of our family. Later that night, as I tucked Emily into bed, she looked up at me with her big, innocent eyes. Daddy, does this mean Rachel will be my new mommy? I paused, unsure how to answer. Rachel will be your stepmom, sweetie, I said gently. But you'll still have your mom, too. Nothing will change that. Emily nodded, satisfied with the answer. I'm glad. I love having 2 mommies. I kissed her forehead, feeling a sense of peace. We had made it through the storm, and now we were building something new, something better. The day of my wedding to Rachel was one of the happiest days of my life. Surrounded by friends and family, we said our vows and promised to love each other for the rest of our lives. Sarah attended the wedding, too, standing quietly at the back of the crowd. I had been hesitant to invite her at first, but in the end, I knew it was the right thing to do. She was part of my past, but Rachel was my future. After the ceremony, Sarah approached me. She smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Congratulations, Tony, she said softly. You deserve to be happy. Thank you, Sarah, I said, offering her a genuine smile. I hope you find happiness too. She nodded, looking down at the ground. I'm working on it. It was the last real conversation Sarah and I ever had. From that moment on, our lives drifted apart, each of us moving forward in our own way. Although life with Rachel was falling into place, the co-parenting situation with Sarah became strained over time. The emotional roller coaster Sarah had been riding started to spill over into her relationship with the kids. While she had improved somewhat after therapy, there were days when she was distant, almost withdrawn, during her visits with Chris and Emily. I began to notice little things. How Chris would come home quiet after staying at his mom's, or how Emily would seem unsettled, asking more questions than usual about why we didn't all live together anymore. It became clear that Sarah was struggling to maintain the balance between her own recovery and being a present mother. One evening, after the kids had returned from Sarah's, Chris asked me something I wasn't prepared for. Dad, is Mom mad at us? I stopped what I was doing, caught off guard. Why would you think that? She's different lately, Chris said, glancing down at his homework. Like, she's not happy when we're there. She doesn't play with us like she used to. My chest tightened. I had hoped Sarah's issues wouldn't affect the kids, but it seemed like that was no longer the case. She's not mad at you, buddy, I said softly, sitting down next to him. Your mom is going through some hard stuff, but it's not your fault. She loves you and your sister very much. Chris nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. He was growing up fast, and I knew he was beginning to understand more about the world than I gave him credit for. He could sense the distance growing between them and their mother, even if he couldn't fully articulate it yet. I wondered if it was time to revisit our custody arrangement. I didn't want to hurt Sarah or take more time away from her, but the kids' well-being came first. If Sarah wasn't capable of being fully present, I needed to step in. After several weeks of seeing how Sarah's struggles were affecting the kids, I knew I had to make a tough decision. I contacted my lawyer again, explaining the situation and asking what my options were. "We can petition the court for a modification of custody," my lawyer explained. "But you'll need solid evidence to show that Sarah's emotional state is impacting the children negatively." I thought about it for days. I didn't want to take drastic measures unless it was absolutely necessary. But as I watched Chris become more withdrawn and Emily's behavior become more erratic, I knew I couldn't stand by any longer. Their emotional health was too important. Before filing anything with the court, I decided to talk to Sarah first. She deserved the chance to hear how I was feeling and to respond before things escalated legally. We met at a coffee shop, neutral ground. She looked tired, her eyes carrying the weight of someone still grappling with inner turmoil. As we sat down, I wasted no time. "Sarah, we need to talk about the kids," I said, keeping my tone gentle but firm. "I've noticed that things haven't been the same during your time with them." She sighed, rubbing her temples. "I know. I've been trying, Tony. I really have. But some days, it's just hard to keep everything together." I nodded, understanding her struggle. "I get that. I really do. But Chris and Emily are starting to feel it. They're picking up on your distance, and it's affecting them. I think we need to consider adjusting the custody arrangement, at least until you're in a better place." Her face paled, and for a moment I thought she might cry. But instead, she nodded slowly. "I don't want to hurt them. If that's what's best for now, then we'll figure it out." I exhaled, relieved that she wasn't going to fight me on this. I didn't want to take the kids away from her permanently, but I needed to ensure they were getting the stability they deserved. Within weeks, the new custody arrangement was in place. The kids were with me full-time, and Sarah had regular visitation on the weekends. It wasn't ideal, but it was the right move for everyone involved. While Emily adjusted to the new arrangement fairly well, Chris began to act out in ways I hadn't seen before. At 10 years old, he was entering the difficult preteen years, but I knew that some of his behavior was a direct result of the upheaval in his life. He started talking back more often, slamming doors when he didn't get his way, and spending hours locked in his room. I could see the anger and confusion bubbling beneath the surface, and I wasn't sure how to reach him. One night, after a particularly rough argument over homework, I sat down outside his door, waiting for him to cool off. After what felt like an eternity, I knocked gently. "Chris, can we talk?" No answer. I knocked again, softer this time. "I'm not here to yell. I just want to understand what's going on." The door creaked open slowly, and Chris stood there, arms crossed, his eyes red from crying. "I hate this," he muttered. I sighed, leaning against the doorframe. "I know, buddy. I know this hasn't been easy." "I don't get why everything had to change," he said, his voice cracking. "Why couldn't things just stay the same? Why couldn't you and Mom stay together?" Hearing those words broke my heart. I had tried so hard to shield the kids from the worst of the divorce, but there was no escaping the fact that their world had been turned upside down. "Sometimes things don't work out the way we want them to," I said softly. "But that doesn't mean your mom and I don't love you. We're both doing the best we can." He looked down at the floor, kicking at the carpet. "It doesn't feel like it." I reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I'm sorry it feels that way. I know things have been hard, and I wish I could make it easier. But I need you to talk to me, Chris. I can't help you if you don't tell me what's going on." He was silent for a moment, then looked up at me, his eyes filled with frustration. "I just miss when things were normal." "I miss that too," I admitted. "But we're going to find a new normal? Okay, we're going to get through this." Chris nodded, but I could tell it was going to take time. I pulled him into a hug, and for the first time in weeks, he didn't pull away. As time went on, things slowly began to improve. Sarah was doing better in therapy and had found a new job that gave her some stability. Our co-parenting relationship, while not perfect, became less strained as we settled into the new custody arrangement. Chris, after our talk, started opening up more. He still had his moments of rebellion, but we were working through them together. He had even begun to bond more with Rachel, which was a huge relief to me. Emily, on the other hand, continued to be her bubbly self, and her relationship with Rachel only grew stronger. It wasn't easy balancing everything, work, parenting, and a relationship, but we were managing. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were moving in the right direction. One afternoon, as Rachel and I were watching the kids play in the yard, she turned to me, a soft smile on her face. "You're doing an amazing job with them, Tony," she said, squeezing my hand. I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through me. "I couldn't do it without you." She leaned in, resting her head on my shoulder. "You're stronger than you think. I know it hasn't been easy, but you've built something beautiful out of all that pain." As I watched Chris and Emily run around the yard, laughing and playing, I realized that she was right. Life had thrown me some brutal challenges, but we had come out the other side stronger. I wasn't the same person I had been before the divorce, but in many ways, I was better. I was a better father, a better partner, and ultimately a better man. As the sun began to set that evening, casting a golden glow over the yard, I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past lift just a little more. The future was uncertain, as it always is, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of what it held. Rachel, the kids, and I were building something new together, a family that was stronger, more resilient, and filled with love. There would always be challenges, but now I knew that we could face them head on. As I stood there, watching my children laugh and play, with Rachel by my side, I realized that this was what I had been fighting for all along. A future worth living for.